Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I had a little bit of technical difficulty there. This is Sharon Danley with Co-op Housing Toronto, and our guest this morning is Josh Hawley. He's doing his master's and working in Ottawa, fighting a number of evictions, regular landlords and tenants, a whole housing issue on everything. So let me bring Josh onto the scene here. There we go. Hello, Josh.
Hi, Sharon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm great, thanks.
Okay. So you have been working behind the scenes in a lot of areas regarding housing. Can you bring us up to date with what you've been doing?
Yeah, sure. I'm working on my master's degree and writing a thesis on co-op housing specifically, which involved a lot of interviews with co-op residents in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. So I'm working on bringing all that information and research together. And then also back in Ottawa now, there's mass evictions taking place. All this housing owned by a company called Timber Creek. They want to evict hundreds of people to demolish the homes and build luxury, they call them resort-style apartments. They did this a few years ago where they demolished 80 townhomes, and they want to do it again. Now they want to demolish 150 homes, 105 of which are occupied. And, there are big families in these homes, so we're talking close to 600 people that they want to push out, including hundreds of children. And what they want to replace it with are, again, luxury apartments, but 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. So they obviously don't want the people who currently live there to come back.
Exactly. And it seems to be, there's just a feeling in the air with co-op housing, isn't there, generally speaking? I mean, where do people go when they're having problems with their co-op, with their board, with whatever? It doesn't seem to be any place for them.
Yeah, exactly. Co-ops were specifically designed to avoid situations like we see in Harringay in Ottawa right now. They were supposed to be an alternative to the regular landlord-tenant relationship, where all of a sudden it's the residents, it's the tenants who have the power to control their own housing. So that's why often, you see co-op housing is proclaimed as having a high level of security of tenure, which you don't have under a regular with a regular landlord, because they can apply at any time to evict you for a number of reasons: for renovation, for demolition, because they claim a family member wants to move in. So having that security of tenure in a co-op is such a key part of it. Besides the democratic functioning, the democratic arguments of having control over your housing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And with this Bill 14 that came up, where evictions are handled now through the landlord and tenant board, that while that seems to make things easier, it doesn't seem to make anything easier for the actual members of a co-op, the resident members. Is it still that way do you find?
Yeah, I think a lot of us would really like to see the numbers of evictions before Bill 14, Bill 14, and after it was passed, to see how many evictions have been pushed through the LTB at this point in co-ops.
Yes.
But for sure, it still stands that it's unfair that co-op members can't go to the LTB on their own. It has to be brought to the LTB by the co-op board for specifically eviction purposes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's no better, really, is it? It's still the resident member is not considered a member, really. It's the board of directors that are considered a member as far as a corporation is concerned in a court of law, or with CHF et al., across Canada. It's all about dealing just with the boards. Now, when you have...
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah. I think for sure dealing just with the boards and giving, deference, right? There's a whole article written on deference given to boards and just the benefit of the doubt, the trust put in a small group of people when you have housing co-ops in Ontario that are quite large, and they're just getting bigger now. The biggest one being City Park, right? Or the one in Toronto, it's like 1,000 units. But a lot of co-ops here, yeah.
Yeah. How can a small board of 8 to 10 people handle, and especially when they don't have any business acumen, generally speaking, they don't have any leadership skills, generally speaking, that they bring to the table. They've not run corporations or anything prior to coming to the board. Again, generally speaking, when you have a group of people that don't have the background necessary to run a multi-million-dollar corporation, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, and this is one of the most interesting things I've found getting involved with co-ops in Montreal and then in Ontario, is that the co-ops in Montreal, the size, the scale of the co-op was actually a major factor when they established them. And they were established around the same time a lot of co-ops in Ontario were, right, the 70s and the 80s. But you had these two different mentalities, where in Quebec it was really from the ground up. It was really the residents in the neighborhood coming together to form co-ops, and they specifically limited the number of apartments or units that would comprise a co-op. So instead of everybody, all 500 or 600 units coming together to form one co-op, even though they're in a very close geographical area, they broke off, and there are 15 different co-ops. So I think the smallest one is maybe 13 units, and the largest one is 32.
Now that's really reasonable.
Sizes. And to them, 32 is a lot.
Yeah.
People who live, this is the Milton Park region in Quebec.
Right. Yeah, that would be a lot compared to what we have, to them. But for us, that would be ideal.
It would be, yeah. And I think you look at the history of the way co-op housing developed in Anglo-Canada, and it was through the federations, right? And CMHC sees the development of co-op housing again through the federations, where CHF was actually formed when there was only one functioning housing co-op. So it was formed from the top down. It was formed from a group of so-called experts who believed that co-op housing was a good solution for whatever reason. They had good intentions, but it was very much a bureaucracy coming in, right? A group of, so-called experts coming in to say, okay, we're going to establish all these housing co-ops and we're going to put people in them. And they're not going to know, whereas in order to have a functioning co-op even sustain itself over the years, over the decades, it has to emerge. It really has to emerge from people coming together and realizing that a co-op is a really good opportunity to control your housing situation.
And the other thing with co-ops too is that they're meant to be, or at least in the original architecture of the co-op design, was to have communities of like-minded, like-experienced, like-thinking people coming together, like older people, people with families, disabled people, all that sort of thing, so that you had a kind of a root basis for community. But what I'm finding is many of the co-ops, there is no community.
No, and it comes down to member education. Again, this is symptomatic of the housing crisis that all cities face right now, where it's just like people need affordable, housing that they can afford. Not even that they can afford, but that like our standards are so low now that it becomes whatever you can find at the cheapest rate. So a lot of housing you can't even afford, but you still have to pay for because you have no other choice. So a lot of people who end up in a co-op, because it happens to be the most affordable to them housing that they can find, or they come up at the top of the list, right? And if you're on subsidy, you're given 3 choices. So if you're finally granted a subsidy, you're given 3 choices for housing, and by the end of it, if you don't accept it, the third one, then you lose your subsidy. So you really just take whatever you can get. And if that happens to be a co-op, you're not aware of your rights. You don't know what a co-op is. But it's up to the co-op itself to educate that member, that new person entering. And ideally, it'd be up to the federations to support the co-op in those endeavors to educate people, to inform them of not just their rights in a co-op, but their responsibilities too.
And that's the other thing, yes, the responsibilities. And when a co-op works well, It is a great community of people, but when it doesn't, and unfortunately in many of them it doesn't, then you have real problems. And creating community, you can't create a community when you have a board that is authoritarian rather than community minded. And unfortunately, when people get a little bit of power that they may never have had before, they wield it in a way that just is unbelievable. And that's where boards need true education. Not, in my opinion, coming from CHF. It's educating them to follow what CHF kind of dictates as to where they want to see things going. Because I personally believe there's a hidden agenda with CHF.
Yeah, well, it seems as though there's a protection of the sector now, rather than co-ops existing to really protect tenants and residents, and for them to have control over the future, and you contribute your time working with your neighbors, not only to build a sense of community, but to lower the costs of your housing. You pitch in 10 hours a month or more, 20 hours a month or 40 hours a month, and that should reflect people's rents, right? You're contributing this time so your rent is lower. But if there's no participation in co-ops anymore, which is, again, it's very suspicious when you look at the federations pushing access to, for one, the landlord-tenant board for co-op boards to take members for eviction, and then also pushing this agenda of non-participation. How can you have a co-op based on, a model of cooperation without participation? It doesn't work. And at a certain point, you start asking, well, what's the difference between a co-op and a regular nonprofit housing agency?
And the thing is, currently, if you had a choice between, a co-op and a regular landlord and tenant situation, if the rents are kind of around the same price, sometimes it might be worth it to pay even $100 more to live in a landlord and tenant situation, because at least there you have far more rights before the courts. You can go to the landlord and tenant board with any complaints of any kind that you have, whereas as a co-op member, you don't have that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Again, a difference in Quebec is that members of housing co-ops, there's not this distinction where in Ontario and the rest of Canada, if you call, co-ops use very distinct lingo, right? Very distinct terms. They say you're not a tenant, you are a member. You don't pay rent, you pay a housing charge. You don't pay first and last month's rent, although now some co-ops are in that, like heading in that direction, which is actually sort of scary. But you pay a member deposit, right? You pay a member deposit, which is also, some people compare to a share in a company. You pay that when you first enter the co-op, and you get it back when you leave. And because the housing co-ops in Canada are primarily, if not entirely, non-equity housing co-ops, you get the exact same amount back as you put in, say, in the 80s, if it's $500. But in Quebec, the members are not considered, they're not distinct members from regular tenants. They're just considered tenants. You're a tenant, but you have control over your housing. So you have access to Quebec's version of the landlord-tenant board. You have protections under law of being a tenant. Whereas, again, in Ontario, it's very strange that they consider co-ops as like private clubs. And this is proven. This is shown. This is the precedent set in court by judges who just don't understand what housing co-ops are, because they're just out of touch. They don't understand the affordable housing world.
And they're loath to get involved in a corporation and tell a corporation how to run. You see, they see it as a corporation, a business. You're absolutely right. They don't think about the fact that these are people's homes.
Yeah, this is housing. This is, people are on subsidy. So a lot of people pay market rent in a co-op, but ultimately it's housing. And this comes into the question, too, about housing as a human right and, unaffordability of housing at this point in cities. It's just nobody can afford. So the question of co-ops becomes very, very important again, like it did back in the 60s and 70s when the co-op housing movement really started to take shape in Canada, for good reason, because conditions were so bad at that time and tenants were being exploited and abused. and evicted for no reason, and conditions were so bad, living conditions in housing, that co-ops emerged as a real alternative, and people were excited about them. So we're seeing, I think, something like that again now, where people are going, oh, well, we have all these tools. You know, co-ops are such amazing tools. They're so open, they're so flexible, and they exist. There's so many of them. They just need to be almost activated at this point and turned into something very positive again, hopefully, as possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we have one person here who says, if your board of directors are liars, file a request for articles, securities, meetings of minutes, list of directors, etc. There's no way around them. So I'm not really quite sure what they meant by that, but anyway, yeah, you know, when things are bad, they're bad. It's really too bad. So you know, I think we talked about this SWOT analysis. Josh, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is SWOT, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you can look at it from a sector perspective, where you look at the whole co-op sector and say, what are the threats? And then you can start talking about, you know, just the value of land that co-ops sit on, and the threats, the pressures that they must be facing. You imagine in a city like Toronto, and a co-op like near the water, right in the heart of the city, near the market. Like, the land would be incredibly valuable.
Well, yes, all along the Esplanade in Toronto, it's most of it's co-ops, and you know, CHF has tries to have a very strong presence here, and the land has become valuable. Co-ops were built way back when this land was not being used very much. But as the city has expanded and grown, and the market has become a more vibrant place, almost a tourist attraction now, I mean, the land is valuable. And some people are concerned that when the buildings aren't being maintained as they should be, they're allowed to diminish. There's this feeling that, well, let's just wait till they get really bad and then we won't bother with them, sell them or whatever. CHF is now in the real estate business, by the way, for those that didn't know, which I find fascinating. Because if they can buy up these buildings cheap and then fix or renovate them for foreign money or for big money, then then ship everybody out into Scarborough or beyond. You know, meanwhile, this has been these have been homes for people for decades for some people.
And I think that's a really valid point. That's a really big threat to the co-op sector on a whole, and to people. But it comes down to people, individuals living in homes for decades. This is their home. They have the right to stay there.
Yeah. But it seems that. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
It seems that, of course, like with so many other sectors in society, money speaks.
Yeah. It's very shocking. And again, I think co-ops and people who live in co-ops, who have the privilege, honestly, of living in a co-op, need to reevaluate and need to look at the strengths of what they have, you know, the tools at their disposal living in a co-op to protect themselves against the mass evictions like we see in Ottawa. You know, if you're a tenant under a huge corporation, or any landlord for that matter, like, you could lose your housing. You could wake up one day and be served with a notice that the landlord wants to evict you. So these are very real threats to tenants, and I think people in co-ops need to realize that they're not immune to it, especially if their co-op falls out of or loses control, loses their autonomy and their control, and stops treating their members and all the residents who live in that co-op with respect and dignity, and where they have real security of housing.
So what would you suggest, Josh, that members can do if they're feeling any number of things? Because, you know, we know that evictions are used as a compliance tool in cases where boards aren't honorable. They will use it as a compliance. And there's times when people need to be evicted for sure. I mean, it's not just all one way. But it's when it's used as this tool, it's a real problem. And it sounds to me like what's happening in Ottawa that may be part of the problem. Can you give us a little bit more about what's happening with that?
You mean the Herringate evictions, the mass
Yes.
evictions? Yeah. So again, that's not in a co-op. That's in just that's a massive landlord corporation. They call
Okay.
themselves an asset manager. So they're evicting people en masse. Again, we're talking about almost 600 people. But evictions are used against co-op members, but then the co-op members don't have an appeal process whatsoever, besides the board, besides appealing to their board. And then if it goes to the landlord-tenant board, this was designed to prevent all the expenses that are incurred by a co-op taking a tenant, or a member, sorry, through the regular court system. But again, in Quebec, the law is that any member of a co-op is basically just a tenant. So although they have responsibilities in a co-op to serve on committees and to commit time to the functioning of their own co-op, they have access to what's called the Régie du Logement, which is the landlord-tenant board in Quebec. So they can take their co-op. If their co-op is evicting unfairly or being abusive, they can take their co-op to their version of the LTB. So I think it's really important that here in Ontario, there's a change in law that tenants of co-ops are considered tenants, really, and that they should have protection against a board. Because there are so many members in co-ops, as you know too, who end up appealing to politicians, right? Provincial politicians, whatever, it's city councilors, just asking for help. But like, first of all, politicians don't understand co-ops, unless maybe Jack Layton, right, who lived in a co-op with his family.
Yeah.
But even then, it's the blame that people get trapped right in the middle. It's like really falling and slipping between the cracks because the politicians blame residents for whatever problems they have in their co-op. They say, well, you guys have ultimate control, you failed, it's your fault.
Get on the board. When meanwhile, that's just, a joke. That's like telling a weak kid in the schoolyard to tell the bully to stop beating them up.
Yeah, exactly.
It
it's
doesn't
very hard.
work.
No, it doesn't work on an individual basis. It has to be through collective organizing. It has to be done all together. So, I mean, you can replace the board in a co-op, but people have to come together, and there has to be people can't be scared of their board because there's strength in numbers. If people organize.
And here's the thing, you make an excellent point. They can't be scared of their board, except that when people are on subsidized or RGI, when they don't want to open their mouth for anything. They support regime change and making things better, but they're too afraid because they will lose. They don't understand that because they stand up for what's right doesn't mean they'll lose their subsidy. But boards and nefarious operators, shall we say, within non-functioning co-ops use that as a tool as well to scare people into submission.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really real concern. People on subsidy, it's under their name, but it's up to the co-op to do the calculations, the rent subsidy calculations. And the co-op, it happens that they can threaten to take away a member's subsidy. And once that happens, obviously they can't afford rent and they have to leave.
Right.
They get evicted, go into arrears. So it's important to know that members have control of their subsidy. It's under their name. It's not under the co-op's name. But again, it's used. People don't know. They're scared. And also, there are favorable sort of practices used to also as tools of compliance, but as like buyouts, like bribes almost in co-ops too, because there's such a lack of oversight.
Oh yeah. I mean, we know that that's gone on, and there is, and the trouble is, you mention it to your politicians, like you said, to the city councilors, if you happen to be a municipally governed co-op, or to your MP if it's federal. And you try your MPP, your provincial government. I mean, you're grasping everywhere, and none of the politicians seem to know exactly how this works. So they can't advise.
Yeah,
And,
no, they
and they're
can't
really
advise.
not interested, I've found.
No, they're absolutely useless. People have to understand that. They won't do anything for any individual co-op. Um, so it's really up to people to organize in their own co-ops to come together. And, I think there needs to be some sort of argument made that a lot of co-ops maybe are beyond being a co-op at this point, and they should be just converted into nonprofit housing, because then at least people have tenant rights.
And
So,
if you're looking from a savings specifically, if it was converted to a nonprofit housing, there'd be a lot of money saved in administration and in excess staff. That there's a lot of staff in co-ops that really don't do their jobs anyway. You could have a management company or whatever, but there could be a lot of savings made by turning them into just nonprofit.
yeah, and it's true. But at the same time, it's hard not to imagine that overnight, after one AGM, everything can change with a new board. It can happen too. Like, there's that
That's
saying,
true.
every co-op is one bad board away from bankruptcy. So,
Yep. You're absolutely right, and that's the thing, and that's where, when it comes to boards, when it comes to their election time, the stuff that goes on behind the curtain with members, threats and all that sort of thing is, well, it's like politics everywhere, isn't it, for election time? But this is where, I don't know, people, from my perspective, people either have to come together and work together. Wherever there's two or more gathered, you have some strength and you get a third. However, people also have to participate. I've noticed that the many that have come to me over the years, they're fine with me or somebody like me doing the work for them. But when I ask them to give me some stuff that's needed to help, can't see them for dust. So if you're not going to be responsible in your housing and take your part in it responsibly, then you can't expect somebody else is going to do it for you.
No, and it can't be. You can't force people to do anything.
No,
obviously, and that's fine. That's the way it should be. That way, people shouldn't have to be forced into doing anything, because ultimately it's not going to work, and people are going to.
Agreed.
Going to be a counter reaction. Yeah.
Anyway, can you tell us a little bit more about what's been going on with Herongate? I'm going to put up one of your. I've got links for this, folks. I'm going to post in the description box above this video when the playback is done, and these are some of the articles by Al Jazeera that were done. And here's the second one. So can you tell us a little bit about that, Josh?
Yeah, sure. So this is a company based in Toronto called Timber Creek Asset Management, and they own what is pretty much an entire neighborhood in Ottawa. Basically, they own it's like 23 acres of land, and it's enough housing for about 4,000 people. And they've been demolishing, or they've been trying to evict parcel by parcel. So again, 2 years ago, they evicted people from 80 townhomes. They own townhomes and apartment buildings. And the townhomes are 3 and 4 bedroom townhomes. There's a lot of people who live in them. Some families are 8 or 9 people. Some of them are just like older couples. So there's a big variety, but it's a family neighborhood, right? It's townhouses. It's some of the only somewhat affordable townhouses in Ottawa. And they want to demolish them to build luxury apartments. So they got away with it 2 years ago, and they issued in May eviction notices to the next parcel of houses. And we've been organizing since for 4 months. We put up like a very, very powerful resistance to all of this. We got it on Al Jazeera. It was the top trending story for 2 days in a row. worldwide. It was huge. We're shooting another video for Al Jazeera now. And, CBC's covered it. Vice News has covered it. And it's again, it's organizing, it's participation, it's getting people involved to fight for their housing. And I think this is a good lesson to learn in co-ops, because when you're pushed to that limit and you face like a crisis moment, that's when people come together. And it's a shame that it has to get to that point for people to come together, but there is hope. So whenever people are faced with such a traumatic, reality, or faced with like a really big ultimatum, essentially, that's when people come together and realize like what is at stake here and what can be lost. And especially in a co-op, you can lose your housing if you're threatened with eviction, but you can also lose control of your co-op, and things can really get out of hand really quickly. So it's important that coming back to participation, that it's enforced, but it's not even enforced, that it just becomes a norm, that it just becomes part of what it means to live in a co-op again, as it used to be. So sitting on a committee, it's hard with such big co-ops to have everybody involved when you have hundreds of people living in a co-op, but at the same time, or hundreds of units, but at the same time, it's important that there is something for everybody to do, because as soon as you don't contribute to your community, you're not a part of it anymore.
True. Now I'm going to bring up a person here who has given us. Let me see. You'll have to pardon. I'm just going to try to downsize this a little bit. And this is from Jean, and he says, a co-op is not a franchise. It is an independent organization. Sounds good, but there is no governing body somewhere that, 1, promotes and manages the concept, 2, educates both the public and especially the members, 3, makes sure every co-op follows the rules, policies, guidelines, etc., and 4, legislation is nearly useless because, in my opinion, there is usually no specific provision for co-op, for housing co-ops. Thank you for your comment, Jean. Do you want to speak to that, Josh?
Yeah, I think, again, if we have the Federation is supposed to be responsible for some of this stuff. But in terms of member education, again, it's up to the few people in the co-op, and there's nothing stopping you from doing this. There's nothing stopping you from organizing a workshop with, again, you're 2 people, you have a friend who also believes in the co-op ideal, to come together and organize your own workshop about member engagement. And if only one person comes out, then that's fine, but at least you've done it, you have experience, and then the next time maybe more people will come out. Because there's no reason we always have to put the responsibility on another group, on CHF.
Oh, no, that's the last person. That's the last group.
It should function autonomously. The co-op should function autonomously through people coming together and working that way. And
I think the problem I was going to say, and I agree with that. I think that the problem is that when members take it upon themselves, let's say, to form a group and just say we're going to have a member education or a member something, unless it's sanctioned by the boards will say in some cases, well, you're not allowed to do that because we didn't sanction it. Excuse me. Yeah, and again, when people are on subsidy, then they feel threatened. They don't want to make the board upset, so then there will be a tendency not to participate because of that factor. Because the board wants to, and again, not all boards, but most want to keep that control factor going because CHF controls the boards.
Yeah, and there's nothing stopping people, though, from organizing. Just book the space at a community center, or meet up at a library or a coffee shop and start talking. Like, they shouldn't control your life, and I know it can feel like that because this is your housing. This is like the one place where people are supposed to feel safe.
Yes.
Is your home. And when you don't feel safe in your home, you don't feel safe anywhere. So I totally understand that. But at the same time, you can get out of that bubble. You need to break out of that bubble and go and meet with people elsewhere and start talking about how to take back control of your co-op for the people. But it can't happen with just one person fighting alone.
Oh yeah.
Even communicating with other people in other co-ops. There's strength in those numbers, but ultimately it has to be brought back home to your co-op. So I mean, maybe all this stuff sounds a little too utopic or idealistic, but ultimately nothing's going to change if people aren't able to organize effectively
Agreed.
together and protect their own interests.
Well, we have Jean here again. He has another comment for us. He says, no co-op is forced to belong to a federation or association. It's an independent organization. Sounds good, but exactly, Jean. I have to say, in my own co-op, it took years to get us not to belong to CHFT, that's Co-op Housing Federation Toronto, because of absolute lies and things that they were doing. And I will, I'll stand to that I'll say that anywhere. But finally, through persistence and education and, talking and that sort of thing, members became aware. They saw for themselves where CHF was really falling down on the job and where they only had their own interest at heart. And we eventually voted them out. Well, a couple of the members tried to get them voted back in, that we would belong to them. And it was quashed. So that's a really good thing. I'm trying to talk them into not belonging to CHF Canada, because they say, oh, well, we get a good deal on insurance. Excuse me? You can get that anywhere if you shop right.
Yeah.
You put a bid out, and you don't let it go to the first person or group. You find out what's the best rate you've got. And when you've got a big complex, insurance companies will be interested, or any other service provider would be interested. It's not necessary to belong to CHF in any form.
No, it's not. And it's actually very, very expensive to belong to these federations. And your co-op would save a lot of money if it wasn't involved. And you have to weigh those pros and cons. Like, what are you actually getting? Cost-benefit analysis. What benefits are you actually getting from being a part of this federation versus the amount of money that you spend on it, and how that money could be used to do important renovations and repairs.
Exactly. And Jean has just said that most members are afraid to be active. Well, like we just talked about, Jean, the big challenge is to engage them. And that is the challenge, isn't it, folks? Is how do we bring engagement into the picture where people can feel safe in doing so?
Yeah. And maybe that just starts with just generic, like, your rights in a co-op, your member rights. Like, you can't be targeted for whatever reason. It's illegal to be targeted for organizing. Again, it's a protection for tenants. It's a protection for tenants under landlord-tenant law, that they have the right to organize. They have the right to communicate with each other. So it should be the same in co-ops.
Exactly. And, I think that things like this, where, and this is where I think that using the live stream on this channel, this is a closed group, by the way, so nobody can be in here. In fact, there was a couple of CHF infiltrators that came in at one point, and they were removed, because this page on Facebook is just for co-op members, and those who are seeking to make things better in the co-op sector for the members. So maybe, some live streams here, if anybody's got any ideas how we could make this live stream work better and make it as a meeting place, please just post your comments in the comment section below. And both Josh and I will read them afterwards and respond to any questions, because this playback will be posted for those that weren't around or missed it for whatever reason. So it will be there for you to view afterwards, and please comment your concerns or ideas. Solution-oriented ideas is what we're looking for, I think. We all know pretty much the problems, so there's no point in rehashing them. But if we can look for ways to engage and create solutions, I think that would be a good mandate for us. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. And just be hopeful about what it means to live in a co-op and the tools at your disposal. How lucky and privileged you are to live in that situation. Ideally, again, I know how traumatic it can be and how people can have PTSD even, and
Oh,
the abuse experienced by a lot of co-op members because of the lack of protections, abuses by boards and property managers and everything. But there are co-ops that work out there, and I mean,
yes.
this speaks to a broader issue in society, I think, where it's just very hard for people to work together now because we're raised to be competitive. We live in a capitalist society. So
Yeah.
we have to, the ideal in a co-op is breaking free from these restraints, breaking free from these norms that we've been trained to follow our entire lives, and learn to work and cooperate together and ultimately control our own housing, which is what this is all
Mm-hmm.
about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. Well, I think that we've been on here about 40 minutes, so I think that's enough time for now. I'm going to post this afterwards, uh, so that anybody who missed it will be able to see it. And I'll also put the links to the Al Jazeera articles that you gave, Josh. And once you've done the this next video for Al Jazeera, could you post that link on under in the comment section below this too? That would be
Yep.
great. So we look forward to your comments, everyone. And we could do this. We can bring on other guests. We can do this once a month, maybe, or give us an idea what you'd like to see, how we can make this page work for us. We want to take action in our own co-ops, so we need to take it on the page too to help one another. So do you have any last words, Josh, before we shut her down?
No, we've covered a lot. I know it's been all over the place, so maybe people want more. Maybe people can submit questions, or again, just more people involved in the conversation. It'd be nice to have 4 or 5 people even on the screen talking together and having just a
Yes,
good.
and with this particular program, I can do that too. All you need to have is a Skype number, which is free, and we can have 3 or 4 people, no problem. No
Yeah,
problem.
cool, great.
Okay, well,
Awesome.
thanks very much, Josh, for taking the time in your busy schedule to do this. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for watching the playback and the 1 or 2 people that were here today. And we'll make an announcement when the next one's coming. Bye, folks.
Okay.